Imagine this. You are standing in the marble corridors of the Domus Aurea in Rome, 64 AD. The air is heavy with incense and the metallic scent of fear. Through the gilded doorways, you hear the soft strumming of a lyre, a haunting tune that seems to mock the screams echoing from the streets below. The emperor sits in his private theater, his fingers deftly moving across the strings, while flames consume half the city. His eyes shine with an artist's satisfaction as he watches his greatest performance unfold not on stage, but in the burning homes of countless souls. This is Nero, and tonight, Rome burns for his art. Before we delve into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Also, please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. It's amazing that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The man who would become history's most infamous performer was born Lucius Domitius Enobarbus in 37 AD. He was later adopted by Emperor Claudius and renamed Nero Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus. But names meant little to him, only the spotlight mattered. From an early age, Nero displayed an obsession with performance that would define his reign and dismantle an empire. He didn't just want to rule, he wanted to be remembered as the greatest artist who ever lived. When Nero became emperor at 17 in 54 AD, Rome expected a young man who would mature into leadership. Instead, they got a ruler who treated the empire like his personal stage. He would force senators to attend his poetry readings, which lasted 8 hours or more, with guards at every exit to prevent escape. Those who dared to fall asleep were carried out, pretending death to avoid his anger. Others would feign childbirth during his performances, knowing only childbirth was an acceptable reason to leave. But Nero's true obsession was the theater. He performed in public, an act so scandalous it horrified the Roman elite. Emperors were gods, not entertainers. Yet there he stood, sweating under stage lights, his voice cracking as he sang tragic roles, his face painted with the masks of heroes and villains. He competed in chariot races, fixing the results so thoroughly that he once won a 10-horse race. After falling off his chariot entirely, the judges still awarded him the victory crown. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD became his masterpiece. While ancient sources debate whether he started the fire himself, his reaction is undeniable. As flames devoured the city for 6 days and 7 nights, Nero saw opportunity. He seized a private stage to perform his own composition, The Sack of Troy, complete with costume changes and dramatic gestures, while citizens perished in the streets below. Later, he used the cleared land to build his golden house, a palace so vast it covered about 300 acres of central Rome, featuring an artificial lake and a 120-foot bronze statue of himself. Nero's passion for performance extended into his personal life with equally disturbing outcomes. He kicked his pregnant wife, Poppaea Sabina, to death in 65 AD during a rage, then married a young man named Sporus, whom he had castrated to resemble his deceased wife. He forced Sporus to wear women's clothing and took him as a bride in a formal ceremony, complete with wedding veils and dowry. But even this wasn't enough. He later married another man, Pythagoras, in a ceremony where Nero played the role of the bride, complete with bridal veil and traditional wedding night. The emperor's final act came in 68 AD, when rebellions across the empire brought his reign to an end. As enemy forces neared Rome, Nero couldn't bring himself to die by the sword like a proper Roman. Instead, he spent his last hours composing poetry and practicing dramatic death scenes. His final words, according to historian Suetonius, were, "What an artist dies in me." Even in death, he couldn't escape the spotlight. From the ashes of Nero's Rome, we move to the Syrian sun of 218 AD, where another young emperor would make Nero's excesses seem almost modest. Elagabalus, born Varius Avatus Bassianus, became emperor at 14 through his grandmother's political maneuvering. Unlike Nero's artistic obsessions, Elagabalus was consumed by religious fervor and sexual experimentation that shocked even the jaded Roman elite. Elagabalus worshipped the sun god Elagabal and brought this Eastern deity to Rome with fanatical devotion. He built a massive temple on the Palatine Hill and forced the Roman Senate to witness bizarre rituals. He danced around the altar in silk robes, his face adorned with cosmetics, castrating himself in religious ecstasy. Roman historians describe him circumcising himself and forcing others to do the same, turning Rome's sacred rituals into performances of Eastern mysticism. But his religious practices were only the beginning. Elagabalus experimented with gender and sexuality in ways that scandalized Rome. He appeared publicly in women's clothing, complete with makeup and jewelry. He asked physicians to transform him into a woman, reportedly offering vast sums to any doctor who could perform such a procedure. He married multiple wives and husbands, sometimes simultaneously, conducting ceremonies that blended Roman traditions with Syrian customs. His marriage to Heracles, a former slave and chariot driver, became one of his most notorious relationships. Elagabalus referred to Heracles as his husband and assumed the role of the wife, even wearing women's clothing in private moments. Court observers noted that the emperor would use cosmetics to accentuate his eyes and remove body hair to present himself as feminine as possible. He allegedly ran a brothel from the imperial palace, personally soliciting customers and accepting payment for his services. Though Elagabalus's reign lasted only 4 years, his impact on Roman society was significant. He elevated his lovers to high positions, regardless of their qualifications, appointing a chariot driver as prefect of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal protection force, and making a former slave his chief advisor, while dismissing experienced senators and generals. The Roman elite watched in horror as their ancient traditions crumbled under an emperor who seemed bent on destroying everything they held sacred. The end came in 222 AD when the Praetorian Guard, led by his grandmother, Julia Maesa, assassinated the 18-year-old emperor. His body was dragged through the streets of Rome and thrown into the Tiber River. The Senate ordered his name removed from all official records, a punishment called damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Yet history remembered him as one of Rome's most bizarre and controversial rulers. Perhaps the madness of absolute power reached its extreme with Caligula, born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus in 12 AD. His nickname Caligula came from the small military boots he wore as a child among his father's legions. But there was nothing childlike about the tyrant he became. When he assumed power in 37 AD, Romans celebrated, thinking they were rid of the paranoid Tiberius, unaware they were swapping one nightmare for another. Caligula's descent into madness began subtly. He restored democratic elections, freed political prisoners, and gave generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard. But after a serious illness in 37 AD, he emerged transformed. Some historians suggest he suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy. Others propose poisoning. But regardless of the cause, the result was an emperor who believed he was a living god. His initial acts of divine madness included conversations with statues. Palace servants found him deep in discussion with the statue of Jupiter, sometimes arguing violently with the marble figure. He covered the statue's head with a cloth during lightning storms, thinking Jupiter was trying to scare him. He even built a bridge from his palace to the temple of Jupiter for easier access to his fellow god. Guards reported hearing him laughing and talking to invisible companions throughout the night. However, Caligula's cruelty set him apart from simple madness. He forced senators to run alongside his chariot for miles, laughing as they collapsed from exhaustion. He forced elderly nobles to fight in gladiatorial contests, delighting in their struggle to lift their weapons. During one banquet, he burst into laughter. When guests asked what amused him, he replied that he realized he could have them all killed with a single word. The laughter vanished from the dining hall. His treatment of his horse, Incitatus, became legendary. Caligula built the horse a marble stable with an ivory manger and purple blankets, appointed it as a priest, and allegedly planned to make it a consul, one of Rome's highest offices. Dinner guests had to speak to Incitatus with the same respect they showed the emperor. The horse dined from golden bowls and drank wine from jeweled goblets, while senators' families starved due to Caligula's excessive taxation. The emperor's sexual appetites were equally disturbing. He committed incest with his 3 sisters, openly boasting about these relationships at public gatherings. He forced senators to watch as he violated their wives and daughters, sometimes during dinner parties. Soldiers would drag women from their homes for his pleasure, later returning them with detailed accounts of his actions to their husbands and fathers. Caligula's building projects showcased his megalomania. He started constructing a bridge across the Bay of Naples, nearly 3 miles long, just to ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate. He built a temporary bridge of boats across the bay, riding back and forth for days, throwing citizens into the water if they didn't cheer loudly enough. This project bankrupted the treasury and served only to satisfy his desire for spectacle. His end came in 41 AD, when Cassius Chaerea, a Praetorian Guard officer whom Caligula had repeatedly humiliated, led a conspiracy against him. They cornered the emperor in an underground passage beneath the palace and stabbed him 30 times. His wife Cézanne and infant daughter were also killed to prevent any attempt at succession. The Senate tried to restore the Republic, but the Praetorian Guard had already declared Claudius emperor, ending the brief hope for freedom. From the marble halls of Rome, we move to the windswept steppes of the Mongol Empire, where Genghis Khan, born Temujin around 1162 AD, united nomadic tribes through brutality that made Roman excess seem civilized. But his most bizarre habit wasn't his military tactics. It was his obsession with biological warfare and psychological torture, revealing a mind as calculating as it was cruel. Genghis Khan's rise from a tribal outcast to the ruler of the largest contiguous empire in history was guided by a simple philosophy: total submission or total destruction. However, his methods of achieving this submission were far from simple. He mastered the art of using terror as a weapon, breaking the enemy's will even before the first arrow was shot. His most unsettling tactic was using plague victims as weapons of war. During the siege of Kaffa in 1347 AD, Mongol forces hurled plague-infected corpses over the city walls, marking one of the earliest recorded instances of biological warfare. However, this wasn't Genghis Khan's original idea. It was his successors who emulated the techniques he had established decades earlier. Khan's armies gathered diseased animals and human corpses, storing them in special wagons that accompanied his forces. When attacking fortified cities, they would launch these decaying projectiles with giant catapults, spreading disease and terror simultaneously. The Great Khan's personal habits were equally unsettling. He believed washing would diminish his spiritual power, so he rarely bathed and forbade his warriors from cleaning themselves during campaigns. The Mongol army moved across Asia like a wave of unwashed bodies, their odor detectable from miles away. Enemy scouts could track their movements by the stench alone. Khan believed this filth made his warriors more fearsome and spiritually powerful. His treatment of conquered peoples showed a mind that understood psychological warfare better than any general before him. He spared skilled craftsmen and engineers, but executed every man taller than a wagon wheel. only the young and traumatized survived to spread terror. Children were forced to witness their parents' execution, then integrated into Mongol society as psychological weapons against their own people in future campaigns. Genghis Khan's sexual practices were systematically brutal. He maintained a harem of thousands of women. However, his true obsession was the rape of enemy leaders' wives and daughters in front of their families. He believed humiliating enemy males was more effective than killing them, as survivors would spread fear more effectively than martyrs. His armies were ordered to bring him the most beautiful women from every conquered city, not for pleasure, but as trophies of psychological domination. The Khan's death in 1227 AD was as mysterious as his life was brutal. Some sources claim he died from injuries sustained from a fall from a horse. Others suggest he was killed by a captured Tongat princess who hit a blade during rape. His burial site remains unknown, as his followers killed anyone who witnessed the funeral procession. Over 800 people died to keep his grave a secret, their bodies scattered across the steppes to prevent anyone from following the trail. Moving from the vast steppes of Asia to the stone castles of medieval Europe, we encounter Vlad III of Wallachia, known as Vlad the Impaler. Born around 1431 AD, his name became synonymous with cruelty, inspiring the legend of Dracula, but the historical reality was far more disturbing than any vampire tale. Vlad's fixation on impalement wasn't mere sadism. It was a calculated psychological weapon to terrify his enemies and maintain absolute control over his people. His exposure to cruelty began during his childhood captivity with the Ottoman Turks. Between 1442 and 1448 AD, he lived as a hostage in their court, observing how they used torture and execution for statecraft. He learned that instilling fear was more effective than using force. When he became the ruler of Wallachia in 1456 AD, he applied these lessons with innovations that even horrified his Ottoman mentors. Impalement became his trademark method of execution. Vlad elevated impalement to an art form. Victims were stripped and forced onto sharpened stakes, positioned to avoid vital organs and prolong suffering. The stakes were raised vertically, letting gravity slowly drive the wood through the victim's body over hours or days. Vlad often dined among the dying, observing their faces as they succumbed to their wounds. In 1459 AD, he infamously impaled over 20,000 Ottoman prisoners outside Tagoviste. This forest of stakes stretched for miles, with bodies arranged by height and social status. Vlad placed his dining table in the center of this grim spectacle, holding diplomatic meetings amid the dying. Ottoman envoys reported that the stench of death and the victims' moans made negotiation impossible, exactly as Vlad intended. Impalement was just one tool in his psychological warfare arsenal. He would invite enemies to dinner, then have them seized and tortured in front of their families. He once invited hundreds of nobles to a banquet, then sealed the doors and burned the building with all the guests inside, telling survivors he was weeding his garden. Survivors spread tales of his methods, turning his fearsome reputation into a weapon that preceded his army. Vlad's personal life mirrored his public cruelty. He married twice, each time to women whose previous husbands he had killed. His first wife, unnamed by history, allegedly committed suicide by jumping from the castle tower to avoid capture by Ottoman forces. His second wife, Ilona Salagi, lived in constant fear of his temper. Court records describe her as jumpy and refusing to eat untasted food. Vlad's obsession with cleanliness contrasted with his bloody methods. He bathed multiple times daily and changed clothes frequently, as if trying to wash away the blood on his hands. He demanded spotless conditions in his castle, executing servants who failed to meet his standards. Visitors noted that his dining hall was spotless, with fresh rushes on the floor and clean linens on the tables, even amidst the stench of impaled victims outside. Vlad met his end in 1476 AD during a battle against the Ottomans. His own nobles, fearful of his unpredictable cruelty, deserted him on the battlefield. His head was severed and sent to the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople, where it was displayed on a stake, a fitting end for the man who had killed thousands in the same way. His body was buried in a monastery, but the exact location is unknown, as monks feared his spirit might return to haunt the living. From the blood-soaked battlefields of Wallachia, we move to the sun-baked deserts of the Aztec Empire, where Moctezuma II, born around 1466 AD, ruled over millions with a combination of religious devotion and ceremonial brutality that made European monarchs seem restrained. His most bizarre habit wasn't his famed collection of exotic animals, but his obsession with human sacrifice as a form of divine communication, conducted with ritualistic precision that revealed a mind entirely consumed by religious delusion. Moctezuma became the 9th Aztec emperor in 1502 AD, ruling from his magnificent capital of Tenochtitlan, a city Spanish conquistadors would later describe as more beautiful than any European capital. Yet beneath the beauty lay a civilization built on systematic human sacrifice, with Moctezuma serving as both priest and emperor in ceremonies that claimed thousands of lives annually. The emperor's daily routine began before dawn with ritual bloodletting. He would pierce his ears, tongue, and genitals with obsidian blades, collecting the blood in jade bowls as offerings to the gods. Court observers described him entering a trance-like state during these sessions, speaking to invisible deities and receiving instructions for the day's activities. His servants collected every drop of his blood, believing it held divine power that could influence the weather and ensure good harvests. Moctezuma's zoo was legendary, housing creatures from across the empire in elaborate enclosures. But his most disturbing collection wasn't animals, it was human beings. He maintained a menagerie of dwarfs, hunchbacks, and people with other physical deformities, whom he displayed for visitors and used in religious ceremonies. These individuals were treated as living sacrifices, their unusual appearance believed to make them more pleasing to the gods. He often had them killed during important festivals, their hearts removed while still beating. The emperor's dietary habits reflected his religious obsessions. He ate only foods blessed by priests and tested by food tasters, not for poison, but for spiritual purity, believing that consuming impure food would anger the gods and bring disaster to his empire. His meals included chocolate drinks mixed with human blood, particularly from sacrificed children, which he believed boosted his divine powers. Spanish chroniclers noted that he would drink this concoction while watching prisoner executions, his eyes glazing over as he entered a state of religious ecstasy. Moctezuma's treatment of prisoners highlighted the systematic nature of Aztec sacrifice. He maintained elaborate prison complexes where captives were fattened for sacrifice, their diet carefully controlled to ensure their flesh would be pleasing to the gods. He personally selected victims for major ceremonies, examining their bodies for physical perfection and signs of divine favor. Those chosen for sacrifice were treated as honored guests until their execution, given fine clothes and elaborate meals in their final days. The emperor's most infamous ceremony was the dedication of the rebuilt Temple Omea in 1487 AD, where historical accounts suggest that over 20,000 prisoners were sacrificed over 4 days. Moctezuma personally performed many of these executions, using obsidian knives to cut out beating hearts, which he then offered to the statue of Huitzilopochtli, the god of war. The steps of the temple were painted red with blood, and the smell of death lingered in the city for weeks afterward. His relationship with the Spanish conquistadors revealed the extent of his religious delusion. When Hernán Cortés arrived in 1519 AD, Moctezuma believed he was the returning god, Quetzalcoatl, as predicted by Aztec prophecy. He welcomed the Spanish with elaborate ceremonies, offering them gold and precious stones, while his advisors warned that these strangers intended to conquer his empire. His religious faith blinded him to the obvious threat, and he became a prisoner in his own palace. Moctezuma's death in 1520 AD remains controversial. Spanish sources claim he was killed by stones, thrown by his own people during a rebellion, while Aztec accounts suggest the Spanish murdered him outright. What's certain is that his religious obsessions and failure to adapt to new realities contributed to the fall of one of history's greatest civilizations. The emperor, who believed he could speak to gods, couldn't recognize human treachery when it stood before him. Across the Atlantic, in the court of France, we encounter Charles VI, born in 1368 AD, whose reign from 1380 to 1422 AD was marked by periods of complete madness that earned him the nickname Charles the Mad. His bizarre behavior wasn't the calculated cruelty of other rulers. It was the product of a mind that had completely lost touch with reality, creating a court where courtiers never knew if their king would embrace them or try to murder them. Charles Dascau's first major episode of madness occurred in 1392 AD during a military campaign in Brittany. While riding through the forest of Le Mans, he suddenly drew his sword and began attacking his own knights, killing 4 men before being subdued. Witnesses reported that he failed to recognize his own brother and screamed that enemies were chasing him. This incident marked the onset of a mental decline that would persist throughout his reign. During his bouts of madness, Charles believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. He had iron rods sewn into his clothing to prevent breaking and refused to let anyone near him. Court physicians tried various treatments, including loud noises to jolt him back to sanity, but these only worsened his condition. He would spend hours standing perfectly still, convinced that any movement would cause him to shatter. The king's identity delusions were equally troubling. Sometimes he forgot his own name and insisted he was not the King of France, but a poor servant named George. During these episodes, he refused to change his clothes or bathe, believing such luxuries were unsuitable for a commoner. He once didn't change for 5 months, his clothes becoming so filthy that servants had to cut them away while he slept. Charles's fear extended to his family. He didn't recognize his wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, and became violent when she approached him. He refused to acknowledge his children, insisting they were impostors sent by enemies. During one episode, he barricaded himself in his chambers for weeks, convinced his family was trying to poison him. He would only eat food prepared by a single trusted servant, and made the servant eat first to ensure it wasn't poisoned. The king's attempts to escape his own body led to increasingly bizarre behavior. He would run through the palace corridors, trying to outrun his own shadow, convinced it was a demon chasing him. He once tried to burn down his chambers, believing fire would purify him of evil spirits. Guards had to wrestle him away from the flames, his hair and beard singed by the heat. His lucid periods were almost more disturbing than his madness. During these moments, Charles would remember his actions and be consumed with guilt and horror. He would weep for hours, begging forgiveness from those he had attacked and trying to make amends. But these moments of clarity were brief, and he would inevitably slip back into delusion, each time emerging more damaged. The political consequences of Charles's madness were catastrophic for France. During his incapacitation, the kingdom fell into civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians, noble factions fighting for control of the regency. The English exploited this chaos, conquering much of northern France during the 100 Years' War. Charles's madness didn't just affect his court, it nearly destroyed his kingdom. Charles VI died in 1422 AD, his mind broken by 30 years of intermittent madness. His son, the future Charles VII, would spend decades reclaiming the territories lost during his father's illness. The legacy of the Mad King highlighted that royal blood offered no immunity against mental illness, and that a ruler's personal struggles could become a national nightmare. From the troubled courts of medieval France, we move to the harsh landscape of 16th-century Russia, where Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible, born in 1530 AD, earned his fearsome reputation through paranoid delusion and systematic cruelty, making previous tyrants seem almost kind. His most bizarre habit wasn't his well-known fits of rage, but his obsession with religious ritual mixed with sexual violence, revealing a mind consumed by contradictions. Ivan became Grand Prince of Moscow at age 3 after his father's death, but he was truly educated by the boyars, nobles, who served as his regents. These men treated the young ruler as a pawn in their power games, sometimes coddling him, and other times abusing him based on their political needs. Ivan later recalled watching these same men, who bowed to him publicly, torture and execute their rivals, teaching him that cruelty was the language of power. His first independent act at age 13 was ordering the execution of Andrei Sviesky, a boyar who had humiliated him. Ivan didn't just have him killed, he had him thrown to hunting dogs, then watched as they tore him apart. The other boyars were forced to witness this, learning that their young ruler had absorbed their lessons in fear and control all too well. Ivan's obsession with religious ritual starkly contrasted with his violent nature. He would spend hours in prayer, prostrating himself before icons until his forehead bled from striking the stone floor. He memorized vast portions of religious texts and could quote scripture during his most violent rages. Witnesses described him alternating between prayers and executions, sometimes in the same breath, as if seeking divine approval for his cruelty. The creation of the Oprichnina in 1565 AD marked Ivan's total descent into paranoid madness. This was his personal army of black-clad horsemen, bearing symbols of a dog's head and a broom, representing their mission to bite and sweep away the Tsar's enemies. The Oprichniks were given unlimited power to torture and execute anyone Ivan suspected of treason, eventually including most of the Russian nobility. Ivan's sexual appetites were as disturbing as his political methods. He maintained a harem of hundreds of women, but his true pleasure came from rape and murder. He would have young women brought to his chambers, then torture them sexually before having them killed. His guards reported hearing screams from his private rooms at all hours, followed by the sound of bodies being dragged away. He once boasted to foreign ambassadors that he had been with over 1,000 virgins, though he admitted most did not survive the encounter. His treatment of his own family highlighted the depth of his madness. In 1581 AD, during a fit of rage, he struck his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, with his metal-tipped staff, fracturing the young man's skull. As his son lay dying, Ivan alternated between grief and fury, praying for forgiveness while raging at the boyars he blamed for his son's death. The prince died 3 days later, leaving Ivan without a capable heir and Russia facing a succession crisis. The Tsar's final years were marked by growing paranoia and religious obsession. He took monastic vows while continuing his violent rule, believing that becoming a monk would cleanse him of his sins while allowing him to maintain his earthly reign. He wore a hair shirt under his royal robes and spent hours in prayer, but these religious practices only seemed to fuel his cruelty rather than restrain it. Ivan's death in 1584 AD occurred while he was playing chess with a boyar, Boris Godunov. He suddenly collapsed, possibly from a stroke, though some historians suggest poisoning. His last words were reportedly a prayer for forgiveness, but his legacy of terror would haunt Russia for generations. The time of troubles that followed nearly destroyed the Russian state, as various factions fought for control of the throne he had weakened through his paranoid rule. From the frozen steppes of Russia, we move to the opulent court of the Ottoman Empire, where Ibrahim the Moor, born in 1615 AD, earned the title Ibrahim the Mad through a combination of sexual obsession and religious delusion that made him one of history's most bizarre rulers. His reign from 1640 to 1648 AD was marked by an insatiable appetite for women and a complete disconnection from reality that nearly destroyed one of the world's most powerful empires. Ibrahim's path to madness began in childhood, confined to the palace's cage, a luxurious prison where potential heirs were kept to prevent them from challenging the reigning sultan. For 22 years, he lived in this golden captivity, with eunuchs and concubines as his only companions, and books and musical instruments as his only entertainment. This isolation from the real world created a mind that confused fantasy with reality, pleasure with power. When Ibrahim became sultan in 1640 AD, after his brother Murad IV's death, he emerged from his cage completely unprepared for rule. His first act was to demand his entire harem be replaced with new women, believing the previous concubines were tainted by his brother's presence. He sent agents throughout the empire to gather the most beautiful women, regardless of their social status or marital situation, creating a harem that eventually contained over 1,000 women. His obsession with female beauty reached pathological extremes. Ibrahim spent entire days examining his concubines in the nude, ranking them by various physical traits and meticulously recording their measurements. He developed specific fetishes for different body types, at one point becoming fascinated with overweight women after falling in love with a 330-pound concubine known as Sugar Cube. He issued imperial decrees requiring all provinces to send him their heaviest women, believing obesity was a sign of divine favor. The Sultan's daily life centered entirely on sexual gratification. Each morning, he would select different women for elaborate sexual games, often involving multiple partners. Palace servants reported that he sometimes spent 12 hours in his private chambers, emerging only to eat or pray. His sexual appetite was so intense that palace physicians frequently treated him for exhaustion and dehydration. Ibrahim's treatment of his concubines revealed the cruelty behind his obsession. He would have women sewn into leather bags and thrown into the Bosphorus if they displeased him, believing that drowning would purify their souls. He once ordered the execution of nearly 300 women in his harem because he suspected one of infidelity. The mass drowning took 3 days, with palace guards rowing boats of struggling women to the deepest parts of the strait. His spending on luxury items for his harem bankrupted the empire. He adorned the walls of his private chambers with sable fur, costing more than the annual revenue of several provinces. He had pillows stuffed with crushed pearls and imported rare perfumes from across the world. He commissioned a throne made entirely of amber and filled his bathing pools with rosewater and milk. Meanwhile, his soldiers went unpaid, and his subjects starved due to excessive taxation. The Sultan's religious practices were as bizarre as his sexual obsessions. He believed his lust was divinely inspired, and that satisfying his desires was a form of worship. He prayed before entering his harem, asking Allah to bless his activities and grant him greater stamina. He commissioned religious scholars to write treatises justifying his behavior, paying them enormous sums to find passages in Islamic law that supported his lifestyle. Ibrahim's detachment from reality became complete when he decided to personally lead a military campaign against Crete in 1645 AD. He had never seen battle and had no military experience, but he believed divine protection would ensure victory. He spent months preparing for the campaign by having his concubines dress as soldiers and stage mock battles in the palace gardens. When advisors tried to explain the realities of warfare, he had them executed for undermining imperial confidence. The end came in 1648 AD, when the Janissaries, the empire's elite soldiers, finally lost patience with his incompetence. They stormed the palace and dragged him from his chambers, where he was found hiding among his concubines. His own mother, the Valide Sultan, reportedly approved his execution, claiming he had shamed the Ottoman dynasty. He was strangled with a silk cord, the traditional method for executing Ottoman royalty, while his terrified concubines watched from behind their veils. From the scented chambers of the Ottoman court, we move to 17th century France, where Louis XIV, born in 1638, would earn the title Sun King through an obsession with ceremony and control that turned absolute monarchy into an elaborate theatrical display. His reign from 1643 to 1715 was marked by such extreme ritualistic behavior that it transformed every aspect of daily life into a stage production, with courtiers as unwilling actors in his grand vision. Louis XIV's fascination with ceremony began in childhood, when his mother Anne of Austria and Chief Minister Cardinal Mazarin used elaborate court rituals to maintain royal authority during the Regency. The young king learned that every gesture, word, and moment of his life was a performance reinforcing his divine right to rule. By adulthood, he had so thoroughly absorbed this lesson that he couldn't distinguish between public performance and private reality. The king's morning routine, known as the lever, became a sacred ritual lasting up to 2 hours. 24 courtiers had specific roles in his awakening ceremony, from the duke pulling back the bed curtains to the prince handing him his shirt. Each action was performed in precise order, with participants bowing at specific moments and speaking only when addressed. The king sat motionless during this ceremony, his face expressionless, like a statue being dressed by worshippers. His eating habits were equally ritualized. Every meal was a public performance, with specific courtiers assigned to taste his food, serve his wine, and hand him his napkin. He never ate in private, believing dining was a royal duty to be witnessed by his subjects. The king consumed enormous amounts of food, often 4 bowls of soup, a whole chicken, multiple cuts of meat, and several desserts, all while maintaining perfect posture and royal composure. Courtiers stood throughout these meals, sometimes for hours, while he ate in regal silence. Louis XIV's obsession with his appearance reached pathological levels. He spent hours each morning in front of mirrors, inspecting his face for aging or imperfections. He wore elaborate wigs costing more than most nobles' annual income, some over 2 feet tall, requiring special doorways in palace rooms. His collection of over 1,000 wigs was maintained by a staff of 40 wigmakers, dedicated solely to the royal household. He changed clothes up to 6 times daily, each outfit change requiring a formal ceremony with specific protocols. The construction of Versailles became his ultimate expression of controlled reality, transforming a modest hunting lodge into Europe's most magnificent palace. His true innovation lay in creating a court system that turned nobility into prisoners of ceremony. Every aspect of life at Versailles was governed by complex protocols, keeping the aristocracy focused on trivialities while he consolidated absolute power. Nobles competed for the privilege of watching him eat, sleep, and even use the bathroom, their former independence replaced by a desperate craving for royal attention. The courtiers' lives became nightmarish performances. For instance, the Duchess of Burgundy once collapsed during a lever ceremony, but was forbidden to leave until the king dismissed her. She stood for 3 hours with a broken ankle, her face pale with pain, while Louis XIV continued his routine undisturbed. The Duke of Saint-Simon noted that courtiers would soil themselves rather than risk leaving a ceremony without permission, their desperation hidden behind elaborate court dress and powdered faces. Louis XIV's sexual habits were as regulated as his court ceremonies. He maintained official mistresses alongside his two wives, but even these relationships followed strict protocols. His lovers had to participate in court ceremonies and uphold specific roles in the royal household. Madame de Montespan, his most famous mistress, was required to attend Mass with the Queen and partake in religious ceremonies, while publicly known as the King's lover. This strange arrangement created a court where adultery was institutionalized and sanctified through ceremony. The king's death in 1715 revealed the ultimate emptiness of his theatrical reign. He had built a system so focused on performance that it lost touch with reality. His successors inherited a bankrupt kingdom, a resentful nobility, and a population that had forgotten how to govern itself. The elaborate ceremonies that sustained his 72-year reign collapsed within decades, leading to the French Revolution and the execution of his descendant, Louis d'Escoing. From the gilded halls of Versailles, we cross the English Channel to encounter Henry VIII. Born in 1491, his reign from 1509 to 1547 was marked by an obsession with marriage and divorce that split England from the Catholic Church and created a legacy of terror, making him one of history's most feared monarchs. His odd habit wasn't just his 6 marriages, but his systematic use of execution to solve personal problems, turning the Tower of London into his private divorce court. Henry VIII began his reign as a golden prince, handsome and athletic, beloved by his subjects and praised by European courts. However, his inability to produce a male heir with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, triggered a psychological shift that would define his reign. His obsession with securing a male successor was not just a political issue, but a personal torment that consumed him, driving him to increasingly desperate actions. The king's break with Rome in 1534 over his divorce from Catherine showed the lengths he would go to fulfill his desires. He declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, driven not by religious conviction, but by sexual frustration. He systematically dismantled England's monasteries, seizing their wealth and land, but his true innovation was using theological arguments to justify personal vendettas. He executed Thomas More and John Fisher, 2 of England's most respected scholars, simply because they refused to recognize his authority over the Pope. His treatment of his wives revealed a pattern of obsession, followed by murderous rage. Anne Boleyn, whom he pursued for 7 years and secretly married, was executed on charges of adultery and treason after failing to produce a male heir. The evidence against her was fabricated, but Henry convinced himself of her guilt through his own paranoid delusions. He watched her execution from his palace window, then quickly declared their daughter Elizabeth illegitimate after her mother's death. Henry's physical transformation paralleled his psychological decline. By middle age, he had become enormously fat, with legs covered in festering ulcers that emitted such a foul odor that courtiers could detect his presence from afar. His armor had to be constantly enlarged, and he needed mechanical lifts to mount his horse. Yet he maintained the delusion of being the athletic prince of his youth, commissioning portraits that depicted him as slim and powerful, while his actual body was grotesque and diseased. The king's paranoia peaked during his marriage to his 5th wife, Catherine Howard. When he discovered her past relationships, he flew into such a rage that witnesses feared for their safety. He had her executed, along with her alleged lovers. But his fury didn't stop there. He executed anyone who knew of her past and failed to inform him, including elderly servants who had worked for her family. The purge claimed dozens of lives, all because a teenage girl had been sexually active before marriage. Henry's final years were marked by increasing isolation and cruelty. He slept with a loaded crossbow beside his bed, convinced that assassins lurked in the palace shadows. He had his food tasted by multiple servants and randomly changed his sleeping chambers to avoid poison. His courtiers lived in constant fear of his moods, knowing that a careless word could lead to execution. The execution block at the Tower of London was worn smooth from use during his reign. His death in 1547 AD resulted from complications due to obesity and infected leg ulcers. His last words were reportedly, "Monks, monks, monks," likely referencing the religious figures he had destroyed during his break with Rome. He left behind a kingdom transformed by his personal obsessions, a daughter who would become one of England's greatest queens, and a legacy of terror that would influence the English monarchy for centuries. From the English court, we moved to the mountains of Wallachia to meet another member of the Dracul family, Radu the Handsome, born around 1437 AD, and the younger brother of Vlad the Impaler. His habits differed from his brother's cruelty, marked instead by complete submission to his Ottoman captors, which earned him the throne of Wallachia while destroying his soul. His reign from 1462 to 1475 AD was characterized by sexual submission and cultural betrayal, making him one of history's most psychologically complex rulers. Radu's transformation began during his childhood captivity, alongside Vlad in the Ottoman court. While Vlad learned cruelty and resistance, Radu chose accommodation and submission. He converted to Islam, learned Turkish and Arabic, and eventually became a favorite of Sultan Mehmed II. His relationship with the Sultan extended beyond political alliance, with historical sources suggesting a sexual relationship that shaped his worldview and political philosophy. His unusual name, the Handsome, reflected his physical beauty and use of sexuality as a political weapon. Ottoman chroniclers described him as exceptionally attractive, with fair skin and delicate features, popular among both men and women at court. He used his looks to gain influence, reportedly serving as the Sultan's lover while maintaining relationships with other powerful Ottoman officials, wielding his beauty as a calculated political asset. When Radu became ruler of Wallachia in 1462 AD, he brought Ottoman customs to his Christian kingdom with enthusiasm, shocking his subjects. He built mosques in Wallachian cities, invited Turkish settlers to colonize his lands, and implemented Islamic law alongside Romanian customs. His court became a hybrid of Christian and Islamic traditions, with Orthodox priests serving alongside Muslim clerics in ceremonies that confused and disturbed his subjects. His relationship with his brother Vlad created one of history's most complex sibling rivalries. While Vlad impaled thousands of Ottoman prisoners, Radu welcomed Ottoman settlers. They fought multiple battles, with Radu leading Ottoman forces against Vlad's army. The psychological toll of this conflict was evident in Radu's behavior, as he reportedly wept after victories against Vlad, torn between loyalty to his benefactors and love for his brother. Radu's sexual practices mirrored his psychological submission to Ottoman authority. He maintained a harem of both men and women, modeled after the Sultan's court, but his main relationships were with Ottoman officials and visiting dignitaries. He used sexual favors as diplomatic tools, hosting elaborate parties where political negotiations took place alongside sexual encounters. His court gained a reputation throughout the Ottoman Empire as a place where any pleasure could be obtained for the right price. The ruler's treatment of his Christian subjects showed the extent of his cultural transformation. He forced Orthodox churches to include Islamic prayers in their services and required Christian nobles to learn Turkish. He appointed Muslim administrators to govern Christian villages and imposed Ottoman taxation systems that enriched Turkish merchants while impoverishing his own people. His subjects began to see him not as their king, but as a Turkish puppet who had traded his soul for power. Radu's death in 1475 AD occurred during a final attempt to reconcile with his brother Vlad. Historical accounts suggest he was poisoned by his own nobles, who had grown tired of his pro-Ottoman policies. His final words were reportedly in Turkish, not Romanian, symbolizing his complete cultural transformation. He was buried according to Islamic rites, despite being born Christian, and his grave faced Mecca rather than Jerusalem. From the cultural confusion of medieval Wallachia, we move to the sophisticated courts of medieval Baghdad, where Hakim bi Amr Allah, born around 985 AD, ruled the Fatimid Caliphate from 996 to 10221 AD, with a mix of religious fanaticism and personal eccentricity that made him one of history's most bizarre rulers. His reign was marked by random prohibitions, architectural obsessions, and claims of divinity that revealed a mind completely disconnected from reality. Al-Hakim's rise to power came at age 11 after his father's death, but his education was overseen by eunuchs and religious scholars who filled his mind with mystical theories and apocalyptic prophecies. He became convinced that he was a divine incarnation, the final imam prophesied to appear before the end times. This delusion shaped every aspect of his rule, from his bizarre laws to his treatment of his subjects. His first act as an independent ruler was to prohibit the consumption of certain vegetables, believing that foods with strong flavors corrupted the soul. He banned onions, garlic, and leeks throughout his territory, with violators facing severe punishment. He then extended these prohibitions to include grapes, honey, and various spices, creating such a restrictive dietary system that his subjects struggled to find acceptable food. His reasoning was that bland food purified the spirit and prepared believers for spiritual enlightenment. Al-Hakim's fixation on controlling people's behavior led to strange rules affecting everyday life. He banned working during daylight, believing darkness was more spiritually pure. Women could only leave home at specific times and had to wear thick veils that nearly blinded them. He also banned making women's shoes, thinking the sound of their footsteps was sexually distracting and diverted men from religious focus. The caliph's architectural ambitions demonstrated his megalomania and detachment from reality. He began the Hall of Wisdom, aiming for it to be the world's largest library. But his grand plans left it unfinished. He ordered many mosques to be built to his exacting visions, which he claimed were divine revelations. Many were demolished and rebuilt multiple times as he received new revelations about their design. His treatment of religious minorities showed his erratic nature. He alternately persecuted and protected Christians and Jews based on his mood and mystical insights. He once ordered all churches and synagogues destroyed, then reversed this and funded their reconstruction. Christians had to wear heavy wooden crosses and Jews distinctive clothing, until he lifted these mandates and invited persecuted minorities into his administration. Al-Hakim's claims of divinity peaked when he declared himself God's final incarnation on earth. He required subjects to bow in his presence and commissioned scholars to prove his divine nature. He claimed to perform miracles and insisted his dreams were prophetic, revealing God's will. His followers, known as Druze, still view him as divine, though most Muslims saw him as a dangerous heretic. His mysterious disappearance in 1021 AD while riding alone in the desert remains unsolved. Some historians think he was murdered by his guards, while others believe he faked his death to escape ruling pressures. His blood-stained clothes were found, but his body was never recovered. Followers claimed he ascended to heaven, while enemies celebrated his presumed death. The truth remains lost in the desert sands. From the mystical courts of medieval Cairo, we move to the rugged 18th century Afghan landscape, where Ahmad Shah Durrani, born around 1722 AD, established the Durrani Empire with military brilliance and peculiar habits that became legendary among his troops. His reign lasted from 1747 to 1739. His life was marked by an obsession with his beard and a collection of severed heads, which he considered trusted advisors. Ahmad Shah's rise to power began with the assassination of Nadir Shah of Persia in 1747 AD. As the commander of Nadir's Afghan bodyguard, Ahmad might have been killed alongside his master, but his reputation for cleanliness and his impressive beard saved him. Persian nobles, impressed by his grooming and his reverence for his beard, allowed him to return to Afghanistan with part of Nadir's treasury. His beard obsession went beyond typical grooming. He spent hours each morning oiling and braiding it until it reached his waist. He had a team of specialist barbers who maintained his beard, using imported oils and perfumes, ensuring not a single hair was out of place. He believed his beard held his spiritual power, and damaging it would cause his empire to fall. Ahmad Shah's collection of severed heads started as a military practice, but became more unsettling. After each victory, he personally selected the heads of enemy commanders to be preserved using techniques learned from Persian court physicians. These heads were mounted on stakes in his tent, where he would converse with them before making important decisions. His officers reported hearing him ask the heads for military advice, as if listening to their responses. His routine involved consulting his preserved heads before any major decision. He named each head according to the deceased's rank and accomplishments, treating them as a council of war advisors. Visitors were horrified to see him speaking to rotting skulls, nodding as if receiving valuable counsel. His soldiers began to believe he could communicate with the dead. His treatment of living advisors was equally strange. Ahmad Shah only accepted advice from men who had never cut their beards, believing facial hair connected to wisdom and spiritual power. He dismissed experienced generals who trimmed their beards and promoted younger officers based on beard length and thickness. His court filled with heavily bearded men of questionable competence, their facial hair their main qualification. Ahmad Shah's military tactics reflected his psychological peculiarities with devastating effect. Before battles, he displayed his head collection to enemy forces, claiming the spirits of dead warriors fought alongside his army. He rode into battle with preserved heads attached to his saddle, their empty sockets staring at his enemies. This psychological warfare proved highly effective, as many opposing forces chose to flee rather than confront an army led by a man reputed to speak with the dead. His attention to personal hygiene extended beyond just his beard to his entire body. He bathed several times a day, using water imported from specific mountain springs, believing that cleanliness was linked to military success. He insisted his soldiers maintain similar standards, making the Afghan army perhaps the cleanest of its time. His enemies often detected their approach by the scent of soap and perfumed oils, rather than the usual odors of unwashed fighters. Ahmad Shah's death in 1772 AD was as peculiar as his life. He succumbed to cancer, but spent his final weeks providing detailed instructions for the preservation of his head, wanting to ensure he could continue advising his successors from beyond the grave. His son Timur Shah followed these instructions, keeping his father's preserved head in the royal palace for several years, before finally burying it according to Islamic law. The empire Ahmad had built through his unique genius collapsed within decades of his passing. From the mountains of Afghanistan, we move to the palaces of 16th century India, where Akbar the Great, born in 1542 AD, ruled the Mughal Empire from 1556 to 1605 AD, blending religious tolerance with personal eccentricity, making him one of history's most complex rulers. His unusual habit wasn't cruelty or excess, but rather an obsession with creating a new religion, combining elements from every faith he encountered, turning his court into a theological laboratory where he assumed the role of divine prophet. Akbar's religious experimentation began with his education under various tutors from different faiths. He learned from Muslim scholars, Hindu priests, Christian missionaries, Zoroastrian teachers, and Buddhist monks, absorbing elements from each tradition while rejecting their claims to exclusive truth. By adulthood, he had developed a syncretic worldview that saw all religions as partial expressions of a single divine truth that only he could fully understand. His creation of the Dini Ilahi, the religion of God, in 1582 had represented the peak of his theological ambitions. This new faith combined Islamic monotheism, Hindu reincarnation, Christian morality, and Zoroastrian fire worship into a system that Akbar claimed was revealed to him directly by God. He declared himself the religion's prophet and required his closest courtiers to convert, though he never forced it on the broader population. The emperor's daily routine centered around religious debate and experimentation. He built the Ibad Khana, a house of worship, where representatives of different faiths engaged in theological discussions while he listened and offered his own interpretations. These sessions could last for hours, with Akbar questioning priests and scholars about their beliefs while developing his own theories on divine truth. He took detailed notes during these debates, compiling them into religious texts that laid the foundation for his new faith. Akbar's approach to religious art mirrored his syncretic philosophy. He commissioned paintings that depicted Hindu gods alongside Islamic calligraphy and Christian symbols next to Buddhist iconography. His court artists created works that Orthodox believers of any faith might have deemed blasphemous, but Akbar saw them as expressions of universal truth. He personally designed religious ceremonies, incorporating elements from multiple traditions, creating rituals that both confused and sometimes horrified visitors to his court. His marriage practices also reflected his religious philosophy. He married Hindu, Muslim, and Christian wives, not only for political alliances, but to demonstrate the unity of different faiths under his rule. Each wife was allowed to practice her own religion, and Akbar participated in their various religious ceremonies, viewing them as different paths to the same divine truth. His court became a living example of religious tolerance, unprecedented in the medieval world. The emperor's intellectual curiosity extended to his governance approach. He abolished the jizya tax on non-Muslims, promoted religious minorities to high positions, and established an administration system that valued competence over religious affiliation. His empire became a haven for persecuted religious minorities across Asia, as his reputation for tolerance spread among communities facing persecution elsewhere. Akbar's death in 1605 marked the end of one of history's most remarkable experiments in religious synthesis. His son Jahangir abandoned the Dini Ilahi and returned to Orthodox Islam, but the legacy of religious tolerance Akbar established continued to influence Mughal policy for generations. His tomb in Sikandar reflects his syncretic vision, combining Islamic, Hindu, and Christian architectural elements in a structure that embodies his belief in the unity of all faiths. From the religious experiments of Mughal India, we journey to the wind-swept highlands of Scotland, where David Thurfern, born around 1084 AD, ruled from 1124 to 1153 AD, with a mix of religious devotion and personal habits so extreme they earned him sainthood while nearly bankrupting his kingdom. His obsession wasn't with power or pleasure, but with founding religious institutions and giving away royal lands to achieve personal salvation, treating his kingdom like a vast monastery, with himself as its chief monk. David's religious fervor began during his youth at the Anglo-Norman court, where he was exposed to continental European monasticism and the reformist movement within the Catholic Church. He became convinced that royal power was a burden endangering his soul unless used solely for religious purposes. Upon becoming king, he launched a monastery-building program that transformed Scotland, but nearly depleted the royal treasury. His routine resembled a monk's more than a king's. Rising before dawn for private prayers, he attended multiple masses daily and spent hours hand-copying religious manuscripts. He wore a hair shirt under his robes and fasted so often that his courtiers worried about his health. Sleeping on a straw mattress in a bare cell within his palace, he surrounded himself with religious symbols rather than royal luxury. The king's obsession with founding religious institutions reached extraordinary proportions. During his 29-year reign, he established over 20 major monasteries and countless smaller religious houses, giving them vast, fertile, and valuable tracts of royal land. By the end of his reign, the church owned nearly 1/3 of all Scottish land, making it wealthier than the crown. David's approach to justice reflected his religious worldview. He established church courts alongside royal courts, often deferring to religious authorities in matters traditionally under royal jurisdiction. He required his officials to take religious vows and insisted that secular law align with church doctrine. His kingdom became a theocracy in all but name, with bishops wielding more practical power than nobles. His treatment of money showed his deep religious conviction. He gave enormous sums to religious causes, funding elaborate churches and monasteries, while his castles fell into disrepair. He refused to collect certain taxes, believing royal wealth was spiritually corrupting, and personally distributed alms to the poor, sometimes giving away his own clothes to beggars, to the horror of his courtiers. The king's marriage to Matilda of Huntingdon was more like a religious ceremony than a royal wedding. He insisted their relationship remain celibate, except to produce an heir, viewing sexual pleasure as incompatible with his spiritual goals. Their court was described by visitors as more like a monastery than a palace, with constant prayers, religious ceremonies, and theological discussions replacing the usual medieval royal entertainments. David's military campaigns were seen as religious crusades rather than political conquests. He fought pagan tribes on Scotland's borders, but his main goal was conversion, not conquest. He established churches in newly conquered areas before building castles, and insisted that captured enemies be offered conversion before execution, with more priests in his army than professional soldiers. He died in 1153 AD while praying in his private chapel. His last words were reportedly a prayer for the souls of his enemies, and he was found kneeling before a crucifix, hands clasped in prayer. The Catholic Church canonized him as Saint David I, acknowledging his remarkable devotion, but his successors inherited a kingdom so weakened by his religious generosity that it took generations to restore royal authority. Our final journey takes us to the peculiar court of the Holy Roman Empire, where Rudolph II, born in 1552 AD, ruled from 1576 to 1612 AD, with an obsession for alchemy, astrology, and the occult, transforming his court into Europe's most unusual intellectual center. His reign was characterized by a total withdrawal from political reality into a realm of magical thinking and scientific experimentation, making him one of history's most eccentric rulers. Rudolph's descent into obsession began with his education in Spain, where he encountered the works of medieval alchemists and astrologers. He believed the universe operated according to hidden principles, discoverable through careful study and experimentation. As emperor, he turned his court in Prague into a refuge for scholars, magicians, charlatans, and genuine scientists, creating an environment where reality and fantasy blended into indistinguishable confusion. His daily routine centered around alchemical experiments and astrological calculations. He would spend hours in his private laboratory, attempting to transmute base metals into gold and seeking the philosopher's stone, which would grant eternal life. He employed dozens of alchemists, astrologers, and mathematicians, paying them large sums to conduct research that more practical rulers would have dismissed as nonsense. His court became a magnet for every occultist and pseudo-scientist in Europe. The emperor's collection of curiosities became one of the most bizarre in European history. He owned thousands of paintings, sculptures, and mechanical devices, but his true passion was for objects he believed had magical properties. He collected supposed unicorn horns, crystals that allegedly revealed the future, and mechanical automata that seemed to move by supernatural power. His palace became a museum of the impossible, where visitors couldn't distinguish between genuine artifacts and elaborate hoaxes. Rudolph's treatment of his courtiers reflected his belief in astrology and magical influence. He would only conduct important business during astrologically favorable periods and required his advisors to have their horoscopes cast before accepting their counsel. He believed certain people had supernatural powers and would promote individuals based on their alleged magical abilities rather than their political competence. His court attracted every fortune-teller and miracle worker in Europe. His relationship with the renowned astronomer Tycho Brahe highlighted both his genuine interest in scientific discovery and his inability to separate legitimate research from occult nonsense. He provided Brahe with limitless resources for astronomical observation, while also funding astrologers who claimed they could predict the future through planetary movements. He viewed mathematics and magic as equivalent, unable to differentiate between empirical research and mystical speculation. The emperor's personal life grew increasingly isolated as his obsessions consumed him. He rarely appeared in public, spending most of his time in his laboratories and workshops. He never married, asserting that romantic relationships would hinder his spiritual growth. He communicated with his subjects primarily through written proclamations, many filled with astrological advice and alchemical theories that confused recipients. Rudolph's mental decline accelerated in his later years, as the gap between his magical thinking and political reality became insurmountable. He believed his alchemical experiments were on the brink of success, while his empire crumbled around him. Religious wars ravaged his territories, yet he remained fixated on his quest for the philosopher's stone. His subjects began to view him as a madman instead of a ruler, and his own family eventually forced him to abdicate in favor of his more practical brother. His death in 1612 came during an alchemical experiment, his hands stained with chemicals, and his laboratory filled with failed attempts at transmutation. He left behind one of Europe's greatest art collections and a legacy of scientific patronage, but also an empire weakened by years of neglect. His court was a strange blend of genuine intellectual achievement and complete delusion, reflecting the mind of a man unable to distinguish between knowledge and fantasy. As you sit here now, perhaps comfortably at home, the tales of these 15 kings might seem like ancient nightmares, safely contained within history books. Yet power corrupts with the same relentless efficiency, whether in ancient marble halls or modern boardrooms. The tools change: social media instead of empowerment stakes, economic warfare instead of biological weapons, psychological manipulation instead of religious terror. But the fundamental dynamic remains the same. These weren't monsters from some primordial darkness. They were human beings, born with the same capacity for love and reason as everyone else. Yet absolute power transformed them into creatures even their own mothers wouldn't recognize, their humanity dissolved in the acid of unchecked authority. They began as children who laughed, cried, and dreamed, only to become nightmares that haunted their subjects long after death claimed them. The courtiers who bowed before Nero's burning Rome, the concubines who drowned in Ibrahim's Bosphorus, the peasants who starved as David built his monasteries, all started their days hoping for simple things: a meal, safety, perhaps a moment of joy. Instead, they found themselves actors in tragedies, scripted by minds so warped by power that they had forgotten their humanity. Tonight, as you close your eyes, remember that somewhere in the world, power still flows through human hands. Remember that the potential for both creation and destruction resides within every heart that holds authority over others. The only difference between the kings in these stories and today's leaders is that we've learned to conceal our monsters better, disguising our cruelties as necessity and progress. But in the darkness before sleep, when the defenses of civilization grow thin and the whispers of absolute power grow loud, the ghosts of these 15 kings still walk among us. They remind us that the line between ruler and monster is written in sand, easily erased by the winds of unchecked ambition and absolute control. In the end, they were all just men who forgot they were human, and that, perhaps, is the most terrifying truth of all.